Một tiếng nó món còn
tiền không? Bữa nay mạng như cái đồ.
Good morning all and welcome to the SUMERNET annual training program. It's really exciting this morning that we're going to be looking at gender. Dr. Hui is going to be talking us through gender and access to and control over water. This is obviously the second session of gender that we've had in the SUMERNET program, but as the first annual meeting, I think it's really important that we understand being online means that we all have a responsibility to participate, to engage, and actually to really step forward with our ideas. I know Dr. Hui has done a lot of work to share some good information with us, but she will be asking us questions. So I'd like all of us just during this morning, the next few hours, to learn, to listen, and to put our hands up and to make comments and to clarify any positions if they would like. Before I pass over, I'd also like to say a big thank you to the whole SUMERNET support team that we have sitting in the Secretariat. Feel free to send us a message via the chat line if you've got any queries, questions or comments or any concerns. Other than that, I wish you a great training session. Thank you all, and over to you. Let's learn about gender. Dr. Hui, you there? We have your slides up and ready to go. We just cannot hear your voice.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thanks. That's loud and clear.
Oh,
thank you.
I'm so sorry. I was muted, but anyway. Okay. So thanks, Leonie. Thank you very much for your very kind words. So I would like to start our section today on gender and access to and control over water. I know that you are, prepared to go to the field. So what I'm going to talk about today, just give you some ideas so that you can get prepared yourselves before you go. But definitely, I will leave the section for like more than 20 minutes. For the first one, actually the training will be divided into two sections. The first one will go for like 50 minutes. So the I will speak for like a 25 minutes or so, and then I will leave the rest of section 1 for Q&A. And then we have like a 10 minutes for a break. And the second section, the sequence is the same. But Leonie said that SEI would like to have 5 minutes or so at the end of the section 2 for evaluation. So definitely we can have a lot of time for questions and raise our ideas, and I would be very happy to answer your questions. So I would like to move on and talk about the gender today. So for the whole training section, we can go through why, what, when, and how. So as you might know already that in its current phase, 2019-2028, SUMERNET 4 focuses on reducing water insecurity, particularly for the poor, marginalized, socially vulnerable groups of women and men in the Mekong region. And water insecurity is defined as not having the right of access to sufficient water of adequate quality or being made increasingly vulnerable to unacceptable levels of water risk. And water insecurity is a result of a complex combination of social, political, demographic, and environmental factors that combined to make certain groups of people particularly vulnerable to water security scarcity. So why gender? When you take gender into consideration, that would help us unpack the power relations at the heart of water insecurities. And in water insecurity, I just mentioned the definition already. But we should keep in mind that water insecurity is not just environmental issue, but also a distributional issue. So what is a distribution? Distribution is a power driven and shaped by social identities and people position in society. So what is gender and social equality? Gender refers to society's construction and perception of the roles, obligations, behaviors, activities, and status that are considered appropriate for men and women based on existing norms of femininity and masculinity, and which are assigned unequal values and degrees of importance. Gender as a social difference translate into power relations that can lead to gender-based hierarchies, inequalities, exclusion, expected behaviors and duties, valuation and status, benefits and disadvantage. So if we consider gender equality in relation not just women and men, but also the ways that gender intersects with class, race, ethnicity, sexuality, less and other significant axes of differences. According to Leach in 2015, gender inequality ultimately requires the realization of all human rights. So if we conduct a critical gender analysis that helps us unpack the power relations which is at the heart of water insecurities. So if you look at the community, you know that the community is not homogeneous, and that consists of different social groups of households, those who have different access to power, different access to waters, and also over control. So if we look at the age, gender, ethnicity, and then you can look at the roles of each group of men, of women, of the rich, of the poor, the middle class, and also the marginalized class, to see what their responsibilities are, and how they practice with water control or access to the water. And the most important thing is that we also have to take into consideration of the social norms in that area. For example, like in the area where ethnic minority people live, and then ethnic minority peoples, they have different cultures and then different practices related to water control and management if compared with the majority of people in the cities or in the delta. So I would like to give you an example. In the central Vietnam, and this research looks at the women's differentiated vulnerability and adaptation to climate-related agricultural water scarcity in rural central Vietnam. So the authors took the field-based study and then they applied the mixed methods approach that combines both qualitative and quantitative analysis. All of this help them investigate the differences in women's vulnerability and adaptation to climate-related agricultural water scarcity in central Vietnam. So the study highlights the heterogeneity of women as a group and their intersectional dynamics as they adapt to increasing agricultural water scarcity on their rural lifestyle. So the findings of the research show that social. Sorry, it's very noisy in the background. If someone who doesn't speak, please mute yourself. So the study that I was mentioning earlier, the author, found out that the social differences, including gender, class, household headship, age, stage of life, shape women's differentiated experiences in vulnerability and in access to water, forest land, and credit. Through the study, the authors also identifies the adaptation differentiations among the women's group to climate change related to agricultural water scarcity. The study also stretches that existing development policy can cause inequality in resource access in practice, and that runs into the risk of further marginalizing certain group of women, especially female-headed household. So later on, when I talk about the field survey, definitely people should take the female-headed household into consideration. So in that sense, you can see the differences between the male-headed household and female-headed household, how they manage and control the water. The authors also found out that the current national target program to respond to climate change to Vietnam is applied to issues of women's differentiated vulnerability and adaptive capacity. So for our research, I think it's very noisy in the background. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So you should mute yourself, otherwise it's very noisy. Okay, so in the this example, we can see that if the policy doesn't pay proper attention to differentiated gender experience, and then you can see that that would make people more vulnerable, especially the female-headed households, in terms of adaptation to climate change. So when you are in the field, you also take policy into consideration to see how it is implemented and then how it has affected to different social groups of household in the area that we conduct research. Another example in the Philippines and Mexico cases also show that only men who perform the masculinity, for example, like the professional performance as a canal operator, appear to be closely and positively linked to being real men. So not only were the operational and territorial water management task, which in real life involved a lot of politics, mainly or only done by men. These tasks were also seen and defined as truly masculinity. If, for example, like in case of performing, the irrigation work. I would like to give another example, in for example, general gender issues in fisheries, for example. When you do research on fisheries, you should take consideration in, for example, like a natural fisheries. So here we can see how the development, their management plans, which, related to protection of interests and livelihoods of different interest groups, including women, the poor, and then the safeguard the environment or resource base. So whether the plan ensure the equity of participation in the development of community-based management plans, or how the conflicts, over community common resources in a gender-sensitive manner is managed, for example. And in aquaculture, we have to make sure that the benefits can be made accessible to women, the poor, because we know that there are differences in tenure and user rights. We need to identify the social impact of aquaculture techniques on livelihood systems to see, the female-headed households or ethnic minority groups, how they can access to water and also how they control the water. What would be the implication for aquaculture for enclosure or existing water resources and decreasing access for non-owners? And then in this case, we also take into consideration the impact of market, like a distant market, how the market, influences or affects the way that people manage and control the water. For example, like in the case of Vietnam, since Vietnam started the economic reforms, and then the shrimp farmers could export shrimp overseas, and then that increases the conflicts between the rich and the poor, and that marginalized the poor out of the access to shrimp ponds, and then the wastewater from the pond also pollutes the waterways, and that also affects the rice plantation of the people in the community. So all of this we should take into consideration and see how it has affected the way that people manage and then control the water. We also take into consideration the less visible roles in fisheries. For example, we should take a look at pay attention to those who are like natural products collectors. They are those who don't have access to shrimp ponds or like clam farming sites. So they just go to the forest, use a hook to catch the shellfish and clams or bivalves, and you see how how they obtain the resources or and processing, because for example, like when they collect the oyster, they need fuel and they need water to process the clams before they bring the meat to the mainland to sell to the trader, and also like those who go fishing, how they manage the storage and how they prepare the catch for sale, and who is involved in the value chain. For example, like for the marketing and traders, who are the traders? Are they from the community or they are from outsiders? How they just impact the way that people catch the shellfish or bivalves from the mangroves. And then we also take a look at the finance, the credit providers and resource owners and market controllers. Most of the time, people in the fishing community, they don't get access to the bank, but they get access to the credit providers, and then they take the credit, with very high interest, and then that, leave them to become more vulnerable. Women and girls may require, more attention because they there's little, country or situation specific information on the roles of women in fisheries, and their roles are most of the time invisible. When we talk about the fishing communities, most of the time they talk about men who go offshore or they go fishing, but women who are behind and they take a lot of responsibility for their husband's products or catch, but most of the time they are invisible. So these days, when you do research on the fishing community, you should also take a look at the new innovations, technologies, and see if they have a negative impact on women or not. And if women are excluded from the active involvement in marketing and have no control over income earned from fisheries activities. The women, for example, in the case of Vietnam, I'm sorry, I'm just giving you examples from Vietnam because that's the area that I'm familiar with most. So in the case of Vietnam, for example, in the Red River Delta, women, who are traders, they cannot get access to the shrimp ponds because they said they are like a bad luck for men. And they said that if women come to the pond and then they would lose their crops. So women are totally excluded from trading the shrimp. And then they just, trade very low value products, that women collected from the mangroves, for example, like a small fish or bivalves, and that leave them, with very low income if compared with men. If they spend the same hours, like 8 hours per day, trading products, but they end up, earning much less if compared with men. So we also should take the culture into consideration because in Vietnam in particularly and in Asia in general, it is like a patriarchal society. So men are more respected, and then women become like invisible. So that's why we should just take this into consideration. Women often play key roles in processing and marketing aquatic resources, but they should not obscure the important role that they can play in harvesting. And in some cases, such as reef fisheries and sandfish collection in areas of the Asia Pacific and Melanesia, women are the main actors, and much of this production contributes directly to household food supply, as it often involves low-value species which are not readily saleable. So now we move on and talk about when and how. So when we talk about when and how, I would like to talk about the outline of the research process. And then for the research process, it consists of 3 phases. The phase 1, which is called the first steps. So we need to define the questions, select methods, and do literature review. And phase 2, that relates to collection of evidence, and then it's about research questions. And phase 3, that relates to the evidence collected to the research question asked and draw conclusion. So now I just go into details, like talk about phase 1. But in phase 1, when we should keep in mind that for the framing the questions, we should keep in mind that how with research advance our understanding of gender and social equality, how will the research contribute to transform development into a practice that benefits the most vulnerable and marginalized. So when we construct the research questions, because we talked about unpacking gender and social relations before, and then when we construct the research questions, we have to keep in mind how the questions would help us unpack gender and social relations. And then here are some tips that we would like to tell you that we should take norms and values into consideration. We have to ask, like, do rules, norms, practices discriminate against some social groups at time of water stress and floods? Which groups could be more vulnerable if compared to the other ones? For example, like when the floods happen, who is in charge of, because when when flood happens and then they have, they don't have clean water, and most of the time the clean is polluted. So he's in charge of, fetching the water, the women or men or girls, and who's taking care of, those who have water-related disease, who would go to the neighbor to ask for water or things like that. So we have to ask those questions that would, reveal how the norms and values just affected the way that, people just take care of the water in case of water stress and floods. In terms of division of labor, we need to see are certain social groups expected to perform certain tasks in function of their identity, how the poor, the rich, the middle class, and then the near poor groups, perform the tasks in function of their identity in terms of, for example, like when water stress or floods occur. So do different people have equal access and control over water resources? And if not, why? And most of the time, for example, like in the case of a community that I did research on before near Hanoi, because that is like the aluminum melting village. So the water is very polluted, even the drinking water. So they have to drill very deep borehole to get the water. But the local government also provide them the clean water from the pipeline. But the rich people, they refuse to use the water from the pipeline because they don't trust the quality of the water. So they just they have their own filtering system, and then they have, spend a lot of money to have, like a very deep borehole, like a 1 meter deep, so that they can get, the clean water. According to them, that is the water is clean. But imagine that if many people have boreholes and then, the water would be clean or not. We don't know yet. So, but still, we can see that, different groups of households, they have different ways, of manage their drinking water, and also like how they access to the clean water. But meanwhile, the female-headed households, they depend on their parents' clean water. So they just go there and then get some bottles from their parents for drinking, but they use the water from the pipeline for washing. Those who have more money, they don't trust the water from the borehole either. So they buy the bottled water, but they spend a lot of money buying the bottled water for their drinking, especially when they have like wedding ceremonies or funeral ceremonies, because when they invite a lot of people to come for large meals and big meals and big groups of people, so they say that the filters cannot just fill enough water for people to drink, and also for cooking. So, but only the rich people could afford that, but the poor people, they cannot. So say that it depends on the resources from others like their parents or neighbors. But the middle groups of household, for example, they have a technique of collecting the rainwater. So they collect the water, but because in that village is very polluted, so they just don't collect the rainwater from the first rain. They just wait for the second rain and collect the water. So they say that the water is clean, and then they just use the rainwater for drinking. And even the old people, they say that when they make tea, the rainwater makes the tea taste better. So, but the young people, they don't have that kind of knowledge, so they don't practice that. So you can see that this kind of practice will be gone if the old people don't transfer the knowledge to the young people and after they pass away. Participation and decision making, we need to look to find out what like are the main barriers for those most marginalized to meaningful participate in the decision that affect their lives, and how can these barriers be surmounted. So when, for example, like in that village, the local government just wanted to provide them the drinking water, and then they wanted to set up the pipeline, and then they didn't invite people to come to any meeting. So people didn't have any voice in the decision-making process at all. Everything was made from top down. And then when it came to people, and they didn't have any voice. And even when the pipeline was broken, they didn't know who they should report to. And then the wastewater comes into the pipeline, and then they said that the drinking water smells like a fish because it doesn't smell good. So all of this makes people become so angry, and then they were protesting against the local government. So all of this we should take into consideration, and then we have to think how we can design the question to catch all of this and see where the problem comes from and how to help the local people resolve the problems. The knowledge in water management and how to make decisions related to water management and water rights allocation is also very important. We have to see who would have the vocal voice in the village and who is silent and why. So we have to look at the dominant types of knowledge, who dominates the decision in that area. So for this one, maybe the key informants interview or focus group discussion would reveal the power relations, where the power comes from, and how it has affected the ways that people make decisions, and why and how the poor and the marginalized, they don't have the voice in the decision making process. So for phase one, we select and narrow the problem down for our study, and then we select a research design, and then we also design measures for variables, and then we select the sample. How do we decide which methods are good for you? Should we use quantitative or qualitative approach? So you can see that the surveys and quantitative approaches are useful when the goals of research call for quantitative data, when the information sought is reasonably specific and familiar to the respondents, and when the researcher has considerable prior knowledge of problems and range of responses likely to emerge. And then if we do the qualitative approach, and then that related to participant observation. So participant observation and qualitative approaches are more appropriate when the study requires examination of complex social relationship or interaction when the investigator decides first-hand behavioral information, and when a goal is to construct a qualitative contextual picture, and when it is necessary to infer latent value patterns or belief systems from behavior, and participant observation is particularly strong in discovering covert, hidden, illegal activities. But we should keep in mind that there is no right method for every situation. So it depends on you. You can make the decision which is good for you and which methods that you want to employ for your research. So what are the variables? Some things that can take more than one value, either words or numbers, and social science research is about defining variables, looking for association between them and trying to understand if one variable causes another. So variables are measured by indicators, and indicators are defined by a range of values. For example, like when we talk about the socioeconomic status, and if we want to use it as a variable, socioeconomic status as a variable, but indicators for socioeconomic status is what? Should we use income or level of education? So if we want to use it as a value, so income we can see like someone earns 30,000 US dollars per year, or like a level of education, like whether it's a high school level or college level. So that is the variables. So for phase 2, we collect data, and then after we collect data, we summarize and organize data. This may be the easiest and shortest part of your research. For me, I enjoy this part a lot because it's fun. I can interact with the local community, with the villagers, and see how they manage and use the water. And I can see like what ethnic minority people and whether their culture and norms would affect the way that they manage and control the water. And I can talk with a lot of people. I can talk with the old people, young people, youth, and also female-headed households. And then they tell me a lot of questions. And at the end of the day, I'm so exhausted because I have collected a lot of information, but most of the time, and then this is the tip for you, that you should just stay up late a bit and try to organize your data. Otherwise, because when people talk to me very quickly, except when you use a recorder, but most of the time I take notes. And if I leave it for tomorrow, and then I don't even read my handwriting because my handwriting is very bad. So I think, at the end of the day, if you can, try to organize the data or information that you have collected during the day into your computer, and try to find it, in different files. For example, like access to the water, and control the water, manage the water, and who does what. For example, like different groups of people, they have different ways, managing the water. For example, like shrimp farmers, they manage the water in the pond totally different compared with those who are engaged in rice in a plantation. So all of this it should take into consideration and try to organize your data in a very systematic and logical way. So later on, if you want to get access to which data, you can find out right away instead of spending a lot of time looking for the file that you want. I can talk more about this later, for the second section when you are in the field. The phase 3, it is like how you relate your data collected to the research question, how to analyze data, how to draw conclusions, and you can access limitation of your study and make suggestion for further study. in order to ask the right questions, the good research question should have three main properties. First, they are limited to scope to certain time, places, or conditions. They are well defined and ambiguous. And some observation, tangible, countable evidence or data can be gathered which is relevant to the questions. Things keep in mind when designing questions is how do I really want to know? What is my objective? How does it fit into my larger research questions? I'm sure that you all have research questions, in mind already. But before you go to the field, you just keep try to see how your data would relate to your research question. How would I answer the question myself? Is the question clear and as short as possible? Is there only one topic in the question? Have I avoided leading questions, or I would have leave rooms for respondent to answer the questions? Have I minimized the use of negative constructions? Is there technical language that needs to be clarified? Does the respondent have knowledge to answer? So that is the tip for designing the questions. Now I would like to leave the floor for you to ask questions, and then I'm very happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. That was just terrific to. Thank you, and that was just terrific to run us through a couple of examples of how gender makes a big difference in people's behaviour and their relationships with water. Some basics of how to construct a gender-focused research study, and then at the end, your three objectives.
You can open your camera because we didn't practice.
Your three phases of research can really, I think, talk all of our research projects through actually what it is they should be focusing on with gender when they're really trying to get their research project up and going, which is the phase they're in. I should also just very briefly say my name is Leonie Pearson. I am the research coordinator for the SUMERNET program. We also have online Sarah Vigil, and she is another of our gender advisors as well. So let's open up for questions now, but we have a team of people here to respond and to engage. Well, I have one question that I would like to start with. You've provided a couple of examples, but I know many people in some of the research teams feel that gender is new to them. It's something they haven't necessarily looked at before, and they might need some help perhaps in their survey or just in asking their questions about how to make sure that they get some gender data. Do you have any sort of tips for how to get sort of make sure that you include gender in perhaps more general research or survey questions like perhaps the collection of socio-economic or demographic information, or even about how you would analyse that with things like how do people get access to water?
Should I go now? Okay. Well, thanks, Leonie, for a very interesting questions. Yeah, to be honest, it is not easy when you go to the field and to ask about gender. And sometimes, as I mentioned before, at one of the training organized by SEI last year, that if I am a man to go to the field, and then if I ask a woman and the husband would not, feel comfortable if a male researcher come and talk to his wife about, the research. He doesn't care about what questions that the researcher is going to ask about. But I mean, the fact that he can see the researcher like a male asking a female from the community, and then they don't feel comfortable about that. So I think, you know, being in the field, I mean, a lot of things could happen that you cannot control of. But therefore, as I mentioned earlier, that you should prepare the questions before you go to the field. And one of the tips is that you should go and test your questions to see if the questions work before you conduct, you know, real interviews. Maybe some questions that when you sit in the room and then you think that they might work, but in reality, you know, it doesn't make sense at all, you know, for the local people. So my tip is that you should do the first survey. You go and talk with the local authorities and collect the secondary data, because you need to have a real picture of the area that you are going to be research on. And then you can, in the case of Vietnam, you can ask permission from the local authority that you can meet with different groups of, you know, households of, you know, people in that community to see what kind of the, you know, problems or what kind of issues that they have related to what the access to and control over, and who, you know, has a problem. I'm sure that, you know, when you go there, people would tell you right away. So at least you have a picture of the village or of the community that you are going to research on after, you know, the first survey. And when you come back, you can just, you know, analyze or look at the reports that you have collected from the first survey, and see what the problems, you know, are. And in the first survey, you can have the telephone numbers of some people in that community so that you can call up and ask questions to clear, you know, your questions before you go for testing your questions. But before you design the questions, you should keep in mind that you always ask questions like a why, who does what. For example, like when you ask about the income, because the income sources would reveal how they take care of the water, how to manage the water. So when you ask about income and sources of income, for example, you always have a column who just, you know, makes income, you know, who takes care of this activity. For example, like in the case of rice plantation, you know, who just, you know, does a plants transplanting the rice, and who prepare the field. And when you prepare the field, you have to bring the water in the field. You have to prepare the soil, right? So and for the whole crop, you know, of the rice, who just, you know, takes care of the irrigation, you know, canals, for example, you know, who open and who just, you know, close the fields, for example. It's the same for the shrimp pond. For example, when the tide is in, they close the gate or they, you know, open the gate. And all of that, you can see who takes care of what. And then, you know, who allows, you know, to do what. For example, girls are not allowed in, or female, you know, are not allowed to close the gate of the shrimp ponds, for example. And you always ask why and who. So that would just gives you like an idea how the gender involves in, you know, the issues that they are conducting research on.
Thank you. Terrific response. I think that provides some nice clarity for us about how we implement gender as part of our research project. I think you've touched on a couple of points in that response around the testing of questions or piloting, and also around making sure you know your area. So context is very important, and being able to be there in place or seeing what happens. So asking the why is this happening and the who does this, those two things together. That's much more in an engaging interview sort of method collection approach that you can do that. And I noticed Sarah in the chat box has identified that perhaps on the more quantitative side, when you're doing a survey, so when questions are set out and then sort of distributed, that the gender guidelines that are up on the SUMERNET website have got some examples of how to include gender actually in some of those survey questions as well. That could be quite helpful for some of the research projects. I noticed also that Sarah has got a comment in the chat box. Sarah, would you like to turn on your camera and you can talk that through for us? Thank you.
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hui, for the great presentation. And yes, just the comment in the chat box was to really remind all of you that we have these guidelines that are meant to be a functional kind of step-by-step way of how do we actually do this, because as Hui mentioned, it is difficult in practice. There are these questions of reflexivity, as in also being aware of who you are as a person. Are you a woman collecting this data? Are you a man? Are you in the majority and the minority, etc.? This might indeed change the questions, but also to be sensitive of taking an intersectional approach. So we're not looking for just in surveys for sex disaggregated data for women and men. So how many women and men are we interviewing? That wouldn't really be enough to collect information on social equity and social equality, because you would need to take it one step further and also collect data in function of socioeconomic class, race, ability, age, etc., because it is actually all of these identities that are going to put people in a position of privilege or not when they try to access water, whether that be in the context of disasters or not. So we have in the guidelines, since a lot of you will be collecting quantitative data, how do you do these surveys? So yeah, we have some examples there that show you, okay, how many women and how many men am I interviewing, but how many women from an upper social class are we interviewing versus how many from a lower social class? Because in certain contexts, other social identities are going to have a much bigger explanatory factor than just gender. So it might be that it is really how much money your household makes that is going to determine how much access and power you have, and not just simply the gender aspects. So these might seem complicated, but they're kind of, you know, the background household information, and we have put examples of how you can do this so that when you're distributing the survey, and especially when you're thinking about your sample, that you really take this into account from the beginning. Because I do know that in certain communities, it might be that it's more the women that want to participate, or that it's more the men, etc. And you as researchers should really try to find ways of overcoming these disparities so that the results are not biased, and also so that your results can really explain more which identity and socioeconomic data actually explains very prevalently the different positions that different people have. So I hope I haven't confused you even more with this answer, but it is explained in a more step-by-step and simple manner in the guidelines. I've shared these in the chat. I know that a lot of you might be familiar with them, but please, for those of you that are not familiar with them, it really does give you, in a written document, a very clear and simple way of how to address these questions. Thank you. Back to Leonie.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Dr. Hui. Now, I think at the moment we don't have any questions from the project teams, but I think this is also perhaps a good time for us just to have a 5-minute break, and then we can come back, and perhaps everyone in that break can really have a think about, for their project, what is the challenge that they're facing in getting gender as part of either their data collection, their analysis, perhaps clarifying that research question, or even broader as part of that method to make sure that they're really addressing the issues around water insecurity for women, men, marginalised groups. So with that, I'd just like to say, firstly, a big thanks so far. We've got some really great information. Let's have a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 10:30 and we'll start again, and we'll learn a bit more about how to actually make sure that gender is part of our research projects. Thank you all.
Người sáng mai ra dơn.
Thank you all. It's good to see us back here online and ready to learn more about how we can ensure that gender is a part of our research program here at SUMERNET. Now, Dr. Hui, I'd like to pass across to you so you can do your second presentation and engage us a bit more with some of the structures around how we can include gender. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonie. Are you going to share the screen again?
Yep. Yes, we're just doing that. We'll get those slides up and then we'll be ready to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, so the first section actually just, prepare you before you go to the field, you have to think about like how to design the questionnaire and, what kind of information that you need for designing the questions. And then you also want to test the questions, before you do the real interviews. But here, I would like to talk about the choosing a field site. So what would be a good field site for you? What would be good for you to conduct your research on water access to and control over, and what would be the criteria for you to consider? So for me, the most important thing is that it is accessible. You can get access to the area, easily, not too difficult, and people there are, cooperative, and then they want to talk to you. But in some area, for example, like in the case of Vietnam, where I did field research in a aluminum melting village, which is very near to Hanoi, and then they are rich, and then they didn't want to talk to us at all because they thought that we would report them to the TV, and they couldn't get a fine by the local government because they were polluting the waterways and also air pollution, things like that. So whether we should just pick that kind of field site, or because it definitely is very interesting, because not many people could get access to, but is it worthwhile first, to pick that field site? I mean, actually it's up to you. But 5 criteria to consider. The first one is, simplicity, accessibility, unobtrusiveness, permissibleness, and participation level. As I mentioned before, if they don't participate in your research, and then maybe that would not make your research, successful. We went to that village, and then we tried to come to some workshops, where the workers were melting aluminum, but the owner just, scares us away. It's like, go. We don't want you to come, and we didn't feel comfortable in that sense. But still, that is the 5 criteria for you to consider. So what is the fieldwork? Fieldwork is based on the idea that data in social sciences, comes not from the labs, but from the living conscious, where people live, and they do activities, they make an income, and fieldwork involves in a narrowing of social distance between the researcher and the researched. Fieldwork can take place in any location, in rural or urban settings. For example, like in the case that I mentioned to you earlier, is in peri-urban of Hanoi. And it's a very interesting for us because it's used to be a rural area, but now it's not really 100% rural, but not 100% urban anymore, because it is very close to Hanoi, but the infrastructure there is not ready to be like an urban place, but people just produce a lot of waste and that pollutes the waterways. And also, people feel very nervous about their environment and also about the water pollution. As a matter of fact, we go to the hair clinic in that community, and then we take a look at the record, and then we found that many people have got cancer, either stomach or lung or sore throat, even because of the air pollution. So it is in any setting, rural or urban, depending on your research, the aim of your research or objective of your research. So fieldwork often leads to detailed written description of a setting or culture called ethnography. Ethnography actually is like it linked to participant observation, and it normally takes a long time in the field. So you have to take into consideration whether you want to do that or not, because whether the resources, financial resources, or time would allow you to employ that approach or not. So time chart it's also called like a seasonal calendar. So as I answered Leonie's questions in section 1, we would like to know who does what and why. So the best way to draw a picture of the activities that people do in that area is to have it like a focus group and ask the participants to draw a seasonal calendar for us. So on one axis is about like the month, and on the other one it's just like issues. So we can ask people to mark the grid to indicate when they undertake an activity and who does that, so that you can see who involves in the activity, and later on, like Sarah mentioned earlier about the income, we can see that who makes that income, and women or man or girls or son, and who is the breadwinner in that family. And then the activities that they earned related to water accounts for how many percentage of the total income of the household, so that you can see how important that types of water or sources of water to that household or to that community. So also the time chart, I used to collect information about the sequence and sources of water and who's in charge. And also the issue to be discussed are decided by the researcher, which is you, and participant on the knowledge that they have related to types of water that they use, or from the boreholes or from the pond or from the mountain, for what purposes, for drinking purposes, or for washing or bathing or things like that. So I would like to give you an example that we did research in the up north of Vietnam, where the Thai ethnic minority people, they were requested to give that land Sweden fields to the rubber plantation company for them to plant rubber trees. So rubber trees are very new to them, but they had to, because they didn't have any other choice. So they had to give the field where they just planted Sweden rice to support their family to the company. And then the company promised them that they would give them money after they sell the latex. The company used a lot of pesticides and herbicides, to spray to the trees, and also to get rid of the weed. And then all of these, runoffs, go into the pesticide and herbicides residues goes into the streams, where people normally, the women, they take a bath, or for them and for their children, because most of the time they bring their children to the field before they go home, and they didn't know, and then until they get a lot of rashes, like they become very itchy, and they have, big problems with their skin. And then they went to the clinic, and then they said that because of the herbicides and pesticide residues that, has gone all the way to the stream, so that, it caused the problems. So when we just asked them about this, the seasonal calendar, and then the sources of water, where they bath, where they take a bath, and the water, where they get the water for the drinking purposes. So all of this just, give you a very complete pictures of the community that you are doing research on. So Sarah also mentioned in her comments before about the different social groups, who has power, and then they have, most of the time, the rich, they have the power because they have, good connection to the powerful people, to the officials, so that they can have better access to clean water. Meanwhile, the female and then headed households and marginalized and the poor, they don't. But in order to find out who's rich, who's poor in that community, it's better to do the wealth ranking. Because I don't know about your countries, but in the case of Vietnam, we have the criteria from the Ministry of Labor. But for me, I don't trust them, so they just do the wealth ranking myself together with the participants in that community to see if they just think that this person is rich, and what would be the criteria for the rich, households, and what would be the criteria for the upper middle income households, and what would be the criteria for the middle, and then the poor and near poor. So that would just gives me an idea about this community, and then how they manage and control the water. For example, like in the fishing community or shrimp farming communities, only the rich would get access to the shrimp pond because they have, capital sources to invest in the bidding process. But the poor, they just only engage in rice in a plantation. So the rice plantation would be affected by and also these days they also have people who are engaged in fishing. They raise a lot of fish, and then the water comes from the fish ponds, the polluted water that the rice farmer take for their rice paddies, and that would just lower their yields and then make them become more vulnerable. So the ranking just helps you see the rich people would engage in what activities, and then the rest for the social groups of households, in how that they make a living, and what activities are related to water sources, and what kind of water that they get access to. The sketch mapping is also very useful. It's simple. It's a hand-drawn map to record a variety of information about local physical and social conditions. Maps are often used to record information that is not available elsewhere. I mean, even if you go to the official local government or officials who are in charge of the land management, they don't have that in their offices. But if you ask people, they can tell you right away. For example, they can tell you the local names for geographical features, land tenure systems, and where the villagers fetch the water from. Definitely, I mean, in the official maps, they don't just, you don't see that. When we go to a village in up north of Vietnam recently, when we asked them, and they say that, oh, we get the water from the mountains. So I'm like, how could you get the water from? They said, oh, we put a pipeline, and we get the water from there because it's not polluted, and then we bring it all the way to our households, and then we have our small storage to store the water, and we charge the water, but we don't charge the water provided by the local government. So all of this information only you can get in from the local people, and then they can tell you, for example, like in the area where people practice like spirit, indigenous knowledge, and then they have spirit forest, and then the spirit, forest. That's the area where people, are not allowed to come. I mean, only for like people bury the dead bodies, or they have the tombs there. But that helps the local people, protect the forest very well, because no one, even outsiders, are allowed to come in and cut the trees. But all of these forest just help them keep the water resources for their rice paddies and for the irrigation purposes. So map also, in the maps that we ask people to sketch for you, map should write in names and prominent features such as road, villages, forest fields, etc., or streams where people can go and have a bath, or things that provide a direction and legend. So map should avoid portraying nearby objects such as large and far objects as small. But it should keep in mind that maps can be misleading, as the scale is often inaccurate, and they can oversimplify a complex situation. Direct observation is very important, and then for us, direct observation is a very useful tool for collecting information that cannot be asked in an interview, or that requires a double check. Direct observation is important because a misunderstanding can occur if local people provide information that does not match with what is seen. Researchers should look carefully and systematically at what is happening in the villages and take notes. And researchers should try to undertake observation at various times to compare changes. For example, like when you go to a community and then we ask them about, illegal logging, and then they ask them, what sources of income do you have? And then they tell you like, oh, I transplant rice, and most of the income comes from agriculture, including, animal husbandry. And then you ask them, oh, how about logging? I say, oh, no, never. Forest rangers are around all the time, and then they don't allow us to go to the forest to illegally cut the trees. But all of a sudden, you look, into the corner of the house, or underneath the steel house, you can see like a lot of timber out there. So, I mean, the direct observation just help you see what is true and what is not true. I mean, sometimes you cannot just, trust the information provided by the respondent, but you have to base on your direct observation and then cross-check the information with other groups of people, or the key informants interview that you can do later on. Time allocation studies is also very important. We did that with the women group in the craft village, where they are engaged in aluminum melting. So we asked them to tell us, at what time they get up, at what time they do all the housework, at what time they go out for fun, at what time they take a rest, and at what time they cook, and at what time they watch TV, and at what time they go to bed. And all of this, we put together, and then we can see that men just have more leisure time than women, and most of the time men are not engaged in housework, because when we ask the women, and then they say that, oh, because men said that these are small things, and then they don't care. They care about how to vote for the president of the country. They talk about politics, but cooking and cleaning the house is a very small things, and they don't care. And then it also reveals that most of the time when the floods or drought happen, women are in charge of, going to the neighborhood to ask for a water or to borrow a bottle of water, but not men, because men said that. And that is the job of the girls and women. So they're not in charge of that. When they come home, meals, must be ready, and there must be drinks or, water there for them. So they don't care, about where or who, brings the water for them. So this one is very nice. If you have time, you can ask them to just write down for you, but depending a lot on the facilitator, because it's kind of boring and it's very time consuming. So you ask people, about the activities they do during the day, and try to make, give them fun a bit. Otherwise it would get bored. And then, people are not interested in doing this. So tips for PRA and RIA for our research, and most of the times we use the tools of the PRA, but there are some tips that for you when you're in the field, that because we talk about direct observation, so we should look, listen, and learn. Try to facilitate, for example, like in the case of time allocation, and then not try to dominate them, the participants, and try not to interrupt them, when they speak. I mean, sometimes they just, talk about something else, but you have to do that in a very subtle way. Otherwise people would feel like they don't want to participate anymore. And if possible, you spend nights in the village where you do research, and be around in the evening, at night, or in the early morning when social activity takes place. When you come, definitely you cannot just, come with your, definitely when you come with your questionnaire already, but you cannot just, take the questionnaire out of your bag and ask them right away, and, what's your name, and, things like that. But actually you have to make a conversation with them, try to make them feel comfortable. And then after, for example, in the case of Vietnam, after some cups of tea, you can ask them, questions, and say that, where you're from, it is the part of the project that you're working on, what is the aims of the project, and what is the objectives of the project. And then, when people understand, they can feel more comfortable to answer your questions. I don't know about the ethics issue at SCI, but most of the time we have to give them the consent form, and if they agree, they can sign, and then they can tell us stories, and whether you want to tape them or not, and if they feel comfortable with that or not. So you have to tell them right from the beginning, not like you do that, but don't tell them. RIA, it's just like the real RIA is the rapid rural appraisal. But in this case, we put like relax. That means you don't want to do it very rapidly. You have to do it in a relaxed way. Don't rush, and allow plenty of time to walk and wander around. So you meet people when it's, it suits them, and when they have time. Sometimes they are busy. For example, like 2 months ago, we did a field survey in the up north of Vietnam. And when we arrived, we didn't know. We talked to the local government, and then they said that's why just come. But when we came, it was their harvesting time. So they didn't have time at all for us, and then we didn't want to bother them. And so we decided to interview them in the evenings after the home from work. But definitely we asked them to see whether that would be okay for them to do that, or if they feel tired, and then they didn't have time for us, and then we had to cancel the trip and come back again. And then that would just cause problems, and also costly because you have to come back. And we encountered one case like that when we came, and then they had a funeral ceremony. So they said that they cannot meet anyone for 2 days because they had to focus on their practices, and then they cannot meet any outsiders. So we had to come back to Hanoi, and 2 days later we went back there. So it's time consuming, and then it's costly because we didn't expect this thing would happen. We interviews, and we use map or diagram, and then ask questions. Ask about what you see. For example, like the case that I talked about, the illegal logging. You can ask somebody else about the timber that you have seen, and see and ask them where it comes from. Not the head of the household that you have interviewed, but you can ask somebody else about that fact, and see if they can tell you any tips about what is going on in that area. So you always use the 6 helpers: who, what, where, when, why, and how, and ask open-ended questions. Show interest and enthusiasm in learning from both men and women, and definitely just allow more time than expected for team interaction and for changing the agenda if needed, as the case that I just mentioned to you just now. So PRA and RRA methods can provide good qualitative information, particularly on tenure and sociological aspects. Breadth length of PRA and RRA tool is the ability to facilitate discussion rather than being simply tools to collect data. When asking for detailed quantification in PRA and RA group situation can make people impatient and is subject to several forms of bias, especially that of more assertive individuals, and which can result in unrealistic data. For example, like when we, in one research project, we asked them about the income because it related to illegal logging, so they didn't want to tell us about the that source of income because there's a lot of money, although it's really labor intensive, but they didn't want to tell us about that. And then the head of the household became very angry, so we had to drop that household, and then we had to interview another household instead. So we had to get prepared for that. And other major weaknesses of PRA and RA methods include the difficulty of investigating differentiation within the PRA and RA groups. For example, that the results of different PRA and RA groups cannot be added together. So you should keep that in mind. Survey, not PRA or RA, usually generate much more realistic production and income data, and household surveys are clearly better for differentiating between household, and the data can be aggregated together, for example, like for a project area. However, you don't look at the data, I mean the income that they tell you, but you have to understand what is behind it, why this household earns more than the other one. I mean, not only look at the income and then you just take a snapshot and tell right away that, these people just have income from shrimp ponds or from fish ponds. But you have to look deeply into it, why this household has access to ponds, whether they have connections, whether they have capital sources, and who is the head of the household, what is the age of the heads of the household, and what is the level of education. of the head of the household, whether those variables are significant when they analyze the data, or whether those variables are related to each other. If those variables are not significant, you cannot draw any conclusion. But I mean, if it shows it's significant, I mean, you can draw the conclusion that the level of education of the head household just makes a difference, because I know he's in the 40s and he's a very energetic and has good connection and has a lot of connection with powerful people. That's why he got access to the fish pond or shrimp pond. So that's why they just earn more than the other people, and that makes them just different from the other social groups in the community. So now I would like to move on and talk a little bit about the sampling. What would be the sample size for your research? The in which a sample is drawn determines to what extent we can generalize from the findings. Is small, is beautiful, or how big would be a good sample size for you to generalize from the findings. Only if the sample study can be shown to represent a larger population can the result of a study of a sample be taken to give reliable information about the larger population. Or if the sample study is not representative, the conclusion drawn from the research must be limited and the sample to the sample studies. So there are several ways to sample. We can do the random sampling or simple random sampling, systematic sampling, stratified random sampling, or cluster sampling. Cluster sampling is for marketing research, and in this case, and most of the time, for us, we use random sampling and or stratified random sampling. I will talk about for each later on now. So for the types of random samples, we can the systematic sample, like a group is chosen for the basis of randomly generated numbers. For the sample or the sample can be chosen with the interval numbers, such as every fifth house in the list of the all households. If you get the list of households from the head of the village, depending on the sample size, for example, like they have about 100 households in that village, and if you just take like 50 households for your sample, and then you take number 1 and number 3, number 5, until you have 50 households from the list. But keep in mind that sometimes the people that you have selected, some are not around, or some are deaf or cannot speak. So you have to reserve the number before or below that the number you have selected for the unexpected cases, so that you can have enough for your sample. So stratified sample is a stratified sample is a sample not drawn from the total population, but from homogeneous subsets of that population. For example, like in the Mekong River Delta, a stratified sample of household would be based on selecting the numbers of each ethnic groups, gender, social classes in numbers that approximate the percentage of these groups represent in the total population. And this helps you avoid the chance that a simple random sample of an ethnically diverse area might yield a sample entirely of Vietnamese people and ignore the Khmer-speaking people. Or in the case of the Red River Delta, for example, if you don't do a stratified sample, and then you can end up with only the people who have fish ponds or shrimp ponds, and you just ignore the those who are like natural products collectors. They don't have access to those ponds, and then they just go to the mangroves to collect the bivalves or fish. And depending a lot on the tide. When the tide is in, they cannot go, and the tide out, they can go. Or vice versa. You can just have only the natural products collectors, but don't have, the rich people like those who have shrimp ponds or fish ponds in your sample. Cluster sampling, that is a way to sample population for which there are no censuses. Cluster sampling is based on the fact that people tend to live or work in cluster people, and this one is most of the time for marketing research. For the way to choose a random sample from a map of the village, you select every third, fourth, or sixth house, for the study, but you have to make sure that to pick the starting point randomly and or you can write the names of every household in the area on a small pieces of paper and put them in a hat and draw out how many people you want to interview, and each time you shake the hat and then pick one, and then you make the list of your sample and go and interview. Before, I know an anthropologist, a very well-known anthropologist from the United States, and then he asked a girl to do that, and every time, if the girl just sits in a chair, and he asked her to do it for all the sides, and then before doing that, she has to wear make sure that she wears the same clothes and sit in the same chair, okay? So that, they can avoid bias. Avoiding bias, think about patterns in population ahead of time. You remain gender sensitive. Analyze the representativeness of your sample. Make sure each element sampled has an equal chance of selection independent of any other event in the selection process. How big should my sample be? The most statistical tests in social science only work with sample of at least 30 to 50 individuals. A sample size of 400 is the biggest size that you would need to do the most common social science statistical test. But I think for our research, we could stick with 30 or 50 individuals. For key informants, you also have to design the questionnaire for the key informant interviews, and you should pick those who are the most knowledgeable in the area. Actually, the key informants may not know everything about all topics, but should have in-depth knowledge of some particular issues. You engage the key informants in semi-structured interviews, transcript works, and time charts. Remember that key informants may not be representative of all groups in the area, and key informants will not be able to provide reliable information about all areas of issues. How you identify key informants, you can use a snowball sampling by peer recommendation. You can ask local authorities and use focus group or random samplings. So for the time of the people you work with, you work with in the field, you work with officials, you work with key informants, a focus group, village meetings, individual and households. And for each group, you can have to think about what kind of information that you need. For example, like from official, you collect information at administrative level, such as statistic or government policies. For key informants, you collect information from specific people with in-depth knowledge or certain topics related to water issues. Focus groups you use to collect specific information in smaller, specified group with common interests or backgrounds. Village meeting you use to collect very general information in larger group, allows group of people to discuss issues among themselves. For individuals or households, it used to collect specific information with individuals or small groups of people, usually related or living in the same home. Because of time, so I don't want to go into detail about interviewing, but I would like to tell you that, for the unstructured interviewing, is used only channel for the channel list of ideas. Interviewers has prepared plan for, but exercise a minimum control during interview, more like a free discussion or observation. But semi-structured interviews, that's what we are going to do. Because we design questionnaire before we go to the field. It's used to a checklist of topics, but depending on the interviewee, not everyone will be asked the same questions. To make sure that you don't forget the topics that you ask the key informants during the process of interviewing. The structured interviewing uses a prepared checklist of topics and questions, and same question are asked of every interviewee, like the questionnaire and survey. Unstructured interviewing is appropriate when purpose of research is unravel complicated relationship and events, or learn how represent situation presented from past incidents, best suited for situation where new light needed on puzzling questions, and good for building initial reports. So semi-structured interview, also it can combine flexibility of unstructured interview with the directionality of survey. Group discussion. For this group discussion, you need focus group discussion of 10 women or mix of women and men, including rich household, middle level household, poor or near poor household, young people, old people, women-headed household, the most climate-affected household, etc. Focused group discussion, for example, in case of flood drought impacted group, we use the PRA tool. We can ask them about historical timeline of livelihood and livelihood metrics, SWOT or risk livelihood metrics, historical timelines of climate events, floods, and we can go back like 20 years or 30 years in the past. Ranking damages impact by seriousness or number affected. Seasonal calendars with particular attention to different times of floods, long event, short event caused by rain, caused by storm, etc. And you should pay attention if productivity of agriculture, fishing, ecosystem based livelihoods over time has changed, or changes in prices of food, energy over the year. And then also institutional Venn diagrams. For data analysis, there are two basic types of analysis: descriptive or statistical. Descriptive analysis describes a data set in words. It does not have to be entirely qualitative, but we can combine both quantitative and qualitative together. For example, like 65% of the farmers surveyed, or 25 farmers said that they prefer to plant the old rice varieties, or things like that. And statistical analysis allow researchers to establish relationship among variables, link causality, and predict a future relationship. Descriptive analysis depends on the presentation of information and comments, from informants in written form. The use of codes and case studies can be an effective way to let local voices come through in your analysis. Qualitative data can also be presented in tables and matrix forms. And other descriptive analysis involved taking numerical values that describe trends in data, such as frequency distribution and variability related to water issues. So the hardest work is writing it all up. You have, why you write your report, you have to decide what audience you wish to reach and adjust your style content accordingly. design on your personal or role. Let your readers know where you are going. Be concise and direct, and ground your writing in specific examples. Edit carefully, and have colleagues or even informants read and comment on draft. And most of the time, we just go back to the area and present the findings to the local community to have their feedback, so that we can come back and integrate their feedback into the final draft of our report to make sure that we have got everything right. The final slide, I would like to touch upon how to disseminate your research results. And here I listed 3 things. The first one is the reports that you have written, and then you condense that into the policy briefs, or you publish it in reviewed international journals, or present your findings at national or international workshops. So with that, I would like to conclude my section 2. Leonie, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Hui. That was excellent. And you've run through a whole raft of issues around research projects and delivery of research projects, obviously pertaining to gender specifically, things to watch out for and look for. But truly, those issues that you have raised around sampling, around approach, around context, are all important for any research project that we do. So it's a very good overview. Thank you for providing that. You just raised one question about research ethics in the SUMERNET program, and I would like to quickly come back to that. I noticed Dr. Sudarat was online, but I can't see her anymore. So I will just quickly respond. We have an ethics training later on, and we are also, all projects should have an ethics consent form and should go through the SUMERNET ethics approach before they reach out into the field. Understanding consent means different things, perhaps for different groups, as you've identified, verbal, written. We can do this in different ways, but still the intention is that we have an informed approach. I do note that on our list of respondents, we have 14 different projects that are online, and those projects cover pure research from collaborative projects, COVID project, to more joint action, and some rapid research work as well. And in that line, I guess I see that Dr. Chayanis has a question for us, and I would like to throw over to Dr. Chayanis if she's available to turn on her camera and perhaps ask the question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Thank you.
Yes.
So thank you very much, Dr. Hui, for your excellent kind of overview. I learned a lot from your presentation and also deliberation, and it seems you have a lot of experience on that. My question is just very short, and I saw that you have a lot of, how to say, not to say secret, you provided us a lot of tips how we could engage with communities and also local government in gender-related research. From your experience in the past, could you give us any specific example that your research or the research of someone you know can actually influence and make a change in the policy or practice linking to the gender's perspective? This will inspire many research teams. I feel that a lot of data that you mentioned is important to collect this or that. How it's actually contributing to the change? Do you have any specific example to tell us?
Thank you. It's a very difficult question. Yeah, that it reminds me of a case study in up north of Vietnam, where the Hmong ethnic minority people live. And we worked very closely with the local government, and then we came up with a policy briefs. And then we had a meeting with them, sit down with them, and the policy dialogue helps a lot, because when we organized that policy dialogue, we brought in the policy briefs, and then we just talked with the local authorities, and then we put a face-to-face the local authorities together with the villagers. And then the local authorities like, oh, we didn't know that because no one reported to us. So the villagers said, here I tell you, I mean, that's the reality, but how come you are our leaders and you don't know about the issues that we are facing? And then after that, they understand about that, and then those issues were reflected in the what they call the annual socio-economic development plans for the next year, for the following year. And then they tried to build a canal that brought the water for the villagers, so that that field, those fields in that area could get water for the irrigated rice. Thank you.
That's great. Yeah, that's great to hear. So the research could actually influence some change. Yeah, it's encouraging. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Excellent. Thanks, Dr. Taylor. And it's important for us to remember our research is about delivering change in policy or in practices on the ground. And as Dr. Hui has identified, different places, that might mean different things. So perhaps in a community in Thailand or in a province in Vietnam, that is a different way to actually influence that change on the ground. I note that we have one more question here from Ms. Unchali. So I might just ask her to open up her camera and then ask the question out loud. Thank you.
Hello. Yes, just a small question to Dr. Hui. Just want to ask about how do you deal with the communities or villagers that expected for incentives when we do a field survey or interview them? Thank you.
What do you mean by incentives?
It could be something in return for their kindness to provide surveys or complete your informations.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That is a very kind of sensitive issues. For example, like in the case of Vietnam, I'm sorry, I just giving you examples from Vietnam, that most of the time people expect a lot from investment projects. So our projects are different. Our projects are not development project or investment projects. So we don't provide them credits or money to do activities or implement, for example, building a canal, for example. But our project is different in the sense that our research, our project is a research project, and then our recommendations or research findings would go to the policy makers and local government, and hope all of this could be reflected in the policy, which in turn would benefit the local people later on. So, but the local people, they don't see that because it's still a long way for them to see whether the information that they provide you would impact them later on or would benefit them later on. So for us, we just pay them a little like a protocols, the fees for the interview, for example, to compensate for the time that they spend with us instead of working in the field. For example, like 50,000 dong, like $2 for like 1 hour, answering our questions, or like people to come to our focus group discussion. But for the focus group discussions, most of the time we pay them for the time that they spend with us, but also we buy like cookies or some sweets. They on normal most of the time in Vietnam they provide tea already, so we don't need to bring the water, but like some sweets and some cookies, so that they can just have like well, most of the time we bring from Hanoi because they also have cookies in the areas, but they are not as nice as the ones that we bring from Hanoi. So they really like the sweets that we bring from the cities, but not from their local areas. So they can have cookies and tips, take some tea and wine, talking to us, and then they are really into it. I mean, they don't come for sweets or cookies, but I mean, if you have something for them, they would really appreciate. Yeah, and for household interview, it's the same. Depending on the area, some they would like to have, some cooking oil, like a bottle of cooking oil, but some they just would like to say, oh, just 50,000 dong would be fine. So we can just do that, and then we make a list of people so that they can sign, and later on we can bring the evidence and send it to SEI. I mean, that's something that we spend it for real, but not fake.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. I just noticed the time, and there's been so much information shared. A big thank you to Dr. Hui for her time. A big thank you to Sarah for inputting thoughts and ideas, as well as from other people for asking questions. It's terrific. And just a reminder that the slides are available, and the PDF version is in the chat box a couple of times, but Agus will be sharing. Yeah. We've recorded this session, so I noticed some people were dropping in and out. That is a challenge in some of our areas. So if you need to come back and have a look at the whole thing or hear it, you'll get a link from Agus as well, so that you can actually come back and or share it with your team if they weren't able to join with us today. On that note, I'd like to say, firstly, that there is a SEI Gender and Environment MOOC that's available. That's a training session over a couple of weeks to really understand some of the challenges about the engagement and interactions of gender and the environment, and that's freely available, and you can jump online to that. Rajesh has provided a link to that. And now I'd like to say thank you, but before you leave, we've got a survey, and we'd really like your input on what worked today, what didn't, and any suggestions you would have for the end. So thank you. The survey is in the chat box as we are sitting here. Agus has put that up. So please jump online to that survey. It's available, and it's really to help us provide better training for you. So we'd really, really appreciate your input onto that. But a big thank you, Dr. Hui, for all your time today and your insights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.